The Hargrove roof went down a little after midnight. No one heard the beams crack over the sound of the wind, but by morning the shape of the barn was wrong. Sunken in the middle like a broken jaw, and the snow inside was already turning gray with ash from a stove no one had reached in time. A quarter-mile down the slope, in a house shaped like nothing anyone in the valley had agreed to call a house, Silas Merrill woke up to silence. Not the silence of a house that had frozen, the other kind, the kind where a roof simply held, and a family simply slept, and nothing in the night had asked to be fought. His wife would later say she did not trust that silence at first. She lay still for almost a minute, listening for the sound the wind usually made when it found a gap, a hinge, a crack, a place to argue its way inside. It never came. 6 months earlier, half the valley had laughed at the shape of that roof. Curved like something torn off a railroad bridge and dropped into a wheat field, they said. Cold as a plow blade, they said. A man does not sleep warm under iron. By the time the storm the old-timers had been dreading finally arrived, the valley would remember that sentence differently. This is the story of why Silas Merrill built a house that looked nothing like a house, what it cost him to be wrong the first time, and what happened when the same people who mocked him had nowhere else to go. If you are watching from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where you are in the comments. Stories like this survive because people still care enough to remember them. If frontier ingenuity like this means something to you, take a moment to subscribe and leave the video a like. It helps these stories reach the people who still value the kind of thinking that used to keep families alive. Silas Merrill had spent 11 years bending iron into shapes that were never meant to bend. He had learned the trade in a rail yard 300 miles east, in a forge that never fully cooled, shaping the arched trusses that carried locomotives over ravines too wide for a man to cross on foot. It was exacting work. An arch that was miscalculated by even a small margin did not fail gently. It failed all at once, usually with weight on top of it. When the rail company abandoned the eastern spur, the forge went cold within a week. Silas was given 2 months of wages, a wagon, and very little else. What he kept, without quite knowing why, was a length of bent rail iron, a leftover piece from the last bridge his crew had finished. It was too short to be useful and too heavy to be sentimental, and he loaded it into the wagon anyway. His wife, Martha, did not ask why. She had learned, over 9 years of marriage, that Silas kept certain objects the way other men kept letters. They arrived in the valley in late spring with their son, Jonah, barely 5 years old, and a homestead claim on land nobody else had wanted. The soil was decent. The timber was not. What good lumber existed nearby had already been claimed, cut, or priced beyond what 2 months of severance pay could cover. Silas walked the property for 3 days before he said much of anything. Martha assumed he was counting trees. He was not. He was looking at the shallow ravine that cut along the eastern edge of the claim, the one the previous owner had abandoned because it flooded every spring and froze into something close to iron every winter. On the 4th evening, he pulled the old rail iron out of the wagon and set it against the fence post, and told Martha, in the plain and slightly embarrassed voice of a man about to say something unpopular, that he did not think they needed as much lumber as everyone assumed. Martha looked at the curved piece of iron for a long moment. "You want to build a house out of that," she said. It was not quite a question. "Not out of it," Silas said. "Like it." She did not laugh, though she later admitted she wanted to. What she felt instead was something closer to worry, the particular worry of a woman who had already moved her family once for a plan that did not survive contact with reality. The nearest neighbor, a rancher named Bartholomew Cray, who had worked the valley for over 20 years, rode over within the week. Word traveled fast on land this empty, and word had reached him that the new man planned to build his house out of iron. Cray was not a cruel man, and he did not come to mock. He came because he had watched 3 families fail on land like this, and he did not care to watch a 4th. "Iron pulls the cold in," Cray said, standing at the edge of the half-cleared lot. Metal doesn't hold warmth. Never has. You put your family under a curved sheet of rail stock. Come January, they'll be sleeping in an icebox with a door on it. Silas did not argue the physics directly. He had spent enough years around iron to know that Cray was not entirely wrong, only incomplete. It won't be bare iron, he said. It's the shape I want. Iron holding the shape. Everything else goes over and under it. Cray was not convinced, but he respected a man who did not raise his voice defending an idea. He rode off with a warning rather than a judgment, and the warning spread to the valley faster than the explanation ever could. By midsummer, most of the homesteads within a day's ride had heard some version of the story. A blacksmith building a house shaped like a train bridge. A family about to spend a Montana winter under coal metal because a husband was too proud or too broke to build a normal roof. What none of them had seen yet was the design itself, because Silas had not shown it to anyone. He had only shown them a piece of scrap iron leaned against a fence post, and let their imaginations build the rest, which they did, enthusiastically and inaccurately. The truth was quieter and more specific. Silas intended to bend salvage rail iron and strap iron into a series of ribs, each one arching from ground to ground the way a bridge truss arched from bank to bank, and then build the walls and roof as a single curved shell over that skeleton, insulated with sod, packed straw, and clay in a manner his Norwegian foreman had once described from his own childhood in a house shaped almost exactly the same way, half-buried, rounded, built to shed weight rather than resist it. He did not have the money for a second attempt if the first one failed. He had, by his own count, enough salvageable iron for one house, and enough lumber for the framing and the door and very little else. Jonah, too young to understand what any of the adults were worried about, mostly wanted to know if the house would be shaped like a whale. Silas told him it might be closer to a turtle. Jonah decided this was an improvement. The construction began in late July, with 3 ribs of bent rail iron sunk in the ground along the lines Silas had marked and remarked more times than Martha cared to count. Bending the iron itself required a forge fire hot enough to soften the metal without weakening it, a fire Silas built into a shallow pit lined with stone, fed by what he could not entirely spare. Each rib took the better part of a day, heated in sections, bent gradually across a curved form he had carved from a hard length of oak, cooled slowly to avoid the brittleness that came from rushing the process. By the second week of August, 5 ribs stood along the marked line, evenly spaced, curving up and over in a shape that did, admittedly, resemble a turtle shell more than a house. The 6th rib was the one that went wrong. Silas had grown tired, and tired men measure carelessly. The bend on the 6th rib came out roughly 2 inches shallower than the others, a difference small enough to miss with the eye and large enough to matter once weight was added. He noticed a discrepancy, considered starting over, and decided instead that it was close enough. It was not close enough. The first heavy autumn rain arrived in early September, weeks before anyone expected it, dumping nearly 3 inches of water over 2 days. The sod and clay roofing, still curing and not yet fully packed, held everywhere except along the section supported by the 6th rib, where the shallower curve created a slight flat spot instead of a true arch. Water does not slide off a flat spot the way it slides off a curve. It sits, it seeps, and on the 3rd night of rain, a section of the roof above the flat spot let go, dropping wet clay and sod onto the floor of what was meant to be Jonah's sleeping corner. No one was hurt. Jonah had been sleeping in a wagon that week, since the interior was not yet finished enough for a small child. But the failure was visible, and visible failures travel. Cray rode past 2 days later, saw the collapsed section from the road, and said nothing to Silas directly. He did not need to. By the following Sunday, the story had grown a mule's worth of unnecessary detail, and more than one homestead was repeating a version in which the entire roof had come down around the family in the middle of the night. Martha, standing in the ruined section with mud on her hands, asked Silas the only question that mattered. Was it the iron, she said, Or was it you? Silas spent 2 days doing something the valley did not see, because it did not happen with a hammer or a fire. He walked the collapsed section slowly, measuring the failed rib against the 5 that it held, comparing the curve of each with a length of cord and a piece of chalk. The difference was small, 2 inches over a span of roughly 14 feet. But he understood, in a way few of his neighbors could have followed without the explanation, exactly what that difference meant. An arch does not fail because it is weak. It fails because it stops behaving like an arch. A true curve carries weight down and outward along its own shape, the same principle that let a rail bridge hold the weight of a full locomotive without a single support beam underneath the center span. A flattened section stops carrying weight along the curve and starts resisting it directly, the way a straight beam resists a load, which is a much harder and much less forgiving job for the same amount of iron. The rain had simply found the one place where the roof had stopped being a true arch and started being, structurally speaking, something closer to a shelf. He rebuilt the 6th rib from new stock, this time checking the bend against the oak formed for separate times before letting it cool, and against the 2 ribs on either side of it before setting it into the ground. It cost him nearly a full week and roughly a quarter of his remaining iron reserve, material he had planned to use for the smaller lean-to shelter meant to house their 2 milk cows through the winter. He did not tell Martha about that trade-off immediately. She found out on her own 3 weeks later, when she asked why the cow shelter was still unbuilt with October closing in. The roof needed it, Silas said. I'll figure something out for the cows. Martha did not answer right away. She looked at the repaired section of roof, now matching the curve of his neighbor's precisely, and then at her husband, who had not slept a full night since the collapse. You'd better, she said, but there was less doubt in her voice than there had been in August, and both of them noticed it. The valley's first real test came in mid-November, a 2-day snowfall that dropped close to 14 inches and was, by local standards, an ordinary early-season storm rather than anything worth remarking on. For most of the homesteads, ordinary meant clearing roofs by hand, since flat and low-pitched roofs built for a milder climate could not shed heavy snow on their own, and standing snow meant standing weight. Cray's own barn crew spent half a day up on the roof with shovels, a routine so familiar to the valley that no one thought much of it. At the Merrow house, the snow simply slid. It did not slide dramatically or all at once. It moved the way water moves down a curved stone, gradually, following the shape of the roof rather than piling against it, coming to rest in a soft bank along the base of the walls rather than accumulating in a dangerous load across the top. Silas watched it happen from the doorway with something that was not quite pride, because pride implied he had been certain of the outcome, and he had not been. He had been hopeful, and hope is a colder thing to stand inside than certainty. What he had not solved, and what became obvious within a day of the snow settling, was the interior temperature. The shape of the roof kept the weight off, but the iron ribs, still partially exposed along the interior ceiling where the sod insulation had not fully closed the gaps, ran noticeably colder to the touch than the walls around them. Martha noticed it first, running her hand along one rib near the stove and pulling it back sharply. It draws the heat right out of the room, she said. Cray was right about that much, at least. Silas did not disagree. He had known, in theory, that exposed iron would behave this way, conducting warmth outward faster than the packed clay and straw surrounding it. What he had underestimated was how much it would matter once the temperature outside dropped meaningfully below what a mid-November storm delivered. The roof had passed its first test. The house had not fully, and both of them understood that a 14-inch storm in November was not the same animal as whatever waited in January. Jonah developed a cough in early December, the kind that worried Martha more than it worried Silas, though neither of them said so directly to the other. It was not, the local midwife assured them after a visit, anything dangerous yet. But the boy's sleeping corner sat closest to the exposed section of ceiling rib, and the midwife, An older woman named Odessa Fenn, who had delivered nearly every child in the valley and buried a few of them, said something Silas turned over his mind for days afterward. "Coal that a child can see, he fights," she said. "Coal that just sits in a room, quiet, always at his back. That's the kind that wears a small body down slow. You want to find where it's sitting." Silas spent an evening with a candle in a steady hand, moving slowly along the interior of the roof, watching the flame for the places where it guttered or leaned, the places where cold air was finding its way along the iron ribs and settling into the room rather than being carried out. He found 3 spots where the clay and straw packing had shrunk slightly as it cured, leaving narrow gaps along the ribs, gaps too small to see easily but wide enough for a candle flame to notice. The fix was not dramatic. It did not require tearing anything down. It required repacking those 3 seams with a denser clay mixture and adding a second layer of dry grass insulation along the coldest sections of exposed rib. Work that took 4 cold days and used nearly the last of the prepared clay stores. What mattered more than the repair itself was what it taught him about the design as a whole. The iron had never been the enemy Cray warned about. The iron was simply honest about where it was exposed and where it was not, cold or wherever the covering was thin, no different from any other material behaving according to its nature. The problem had never been metal in a house. The problem had been 3 unfinished seams in a house that was, in every other section, already doing exactly what he had built it to do. Jonah's cough eased within the week, though Martha would later say she never stopped listening for it at night. Not that whole winter. By late December, the Merrill homestead had become a subject of quiet, ongoing interest rather than open mockery, though the shift was gradual enough that no one in the valley would have described it that way at the time. Cray Road passed more often than the road strictly required. He did not always stop, but when he did, his questions had changed in tone. He no longer asked why Silas had built the roof that way. He asked how much iron the 6th rib had needed, how the clay mixture had been prepared, whether the sod alone would have done the job without the straw layer underneath it. Silas answered plainly, without pride and without false modesty, because he had learned by then that both were equally likely to end a useful conversation. Word reached them, through Cray and through the general store the family visited twice a month, that 2 other homesteads in the valley were having trouble with roof snow load that winter, families who had built conventional pitched roofs sized for a milder region than the one they had actually settled. One family, the Hargroves, had already reinforced their barn roof once in November after a smaller storm left it groaning under the weight. Martha, hearing this, said little, but Silas noticed she had stopped bracing herself when someone in town mentioned the shape of their house. What none of them knew yet, in the last week of December, was that the valley's early season storms, the 14-inch snow in November and the smaller falls through early December, had been a mild preview of something the old-timers along the eastern ridge had started predicting with more certainty than usual. A cold front was building far to the north, larger and slower than anything the valley had seen in nearly a decade, and it was still more than 2 weeks away from arriving. The storm reached the valley on the 9th of January, and it did not behave like the storms before it. It did not arrive quickly and pass. It settled over the region for the better part of 4 days, dropping snow measured not in inches but in feet, driven sideways by winds strong enough to reshape drifts overnight, burying fence lines and outbuildings under accumulations the valley had not seen since before Cray had settled there. The Merrill house held through the first 2 days without incident, the arched roof continuing to shed snow in the same steady, unremarkable way it had in November, the repaired seams along the interior ribs keeping the cold contained rather than settling into the rooms. The Hargrove barn did not hold. On the 3rd night of the storm, the accumulated weight on the flat sections of the Hargrove roof, weakened further by the reinforcement work done in haste back in November, finally exceeded what the structure could carry. The collapse happened after midnight, loud enough to wake the family inside the adjoining house, though not loud enough, in the noise of the wind, to be heard beyond their own property. No one was in the barn, when it fell. But the barn had housed their winter feed stores, their 2 horses, and the makeshift shelter they had built for an elderly relative staying with them through the season. A widow named Constance Hargrove, who had been sleeping in the barn's small side room rather than crowd the already full farmhouse. By the time Elias Hargrove, the family's eldest son, made out to the wreckage through waist-deep snow and near-zero visibility, Constance was unhurt, but trapped beneath a fallen beam. The horses were injured but alive, and the family's only shelter for either was gone. The farmhouse itself, still standing but overwhelmed with children and now an injured elderly woman, had no room and no reliable heat source strong enough to keep an already frail relative safe through what remained of the storm. Elias Hargrove made the half-mile walk to the nearest occupied house through conditions that, by his own later account, he was not entirely certain he would survive. The nearest occupied house was the Merrill homestead. Silas opened the door to a man he barely recognized, snow-caked and shaking, who managed only a few words before Martha had already pulled him inside toward the stove. They went back out together, Silas and Elias Hargrove, dragging the makeshift sled to the worst of the wind to bring Constance Hargrove back to the one house in the valley that had not lost a single section of roof in 4 days of continuous snowfall. She arrived barely conscious from cold, and Martha and Odessa Fenn, sent for through the storm by a neighbor's boy on horseback, worked through the rest of that night to bring her body temperature back to something safe. The room she was placed in was the same room where, weeks earlier, Silas had knelt with a candle searching for cold seams along the ceiling ribs. It held steady heat through the rest of the storm, without a single gap for the wind to find. 2 of the injured horses were brought in as well, sheltered in the covered space Silas had eventually built along the side of the house, the modest lean-to he had promised Martha back in October, finished in late November with the last of his iron reserves after all. By the time the storm broke on the 13th of January, 7 people and 2 horses had spent portions of that final night inside a house that, 5 months earlier, half the valley had assumed would freeze its own family before winter finished with them. Cray came by 3 days after the roads cleared enough to travel. He did not bring up the past directly. He stood in the main room for a while, running his hand along one of the interior ribs, the same one Martha had once pulled her hand back from in surprise. It was warm now, evenly warm, indistinguishable by touch from the clay around it. "I was wrong about the iron," he said finally. It was not an easy thing for a man like Cray to say, and both of them understood that. Silas did not gloat, because there was very little left in him to gloat with, and because he understood, better than most, how close the 6th rib had come to proving Cray right the first time. By the following autumn, 2 other homesteads in the valley had begun their own arch roofs, built with salvaged iron bought cheap from a rail depot 2 counties over. Following measurements Silas had drawn out for them on a scrap of paper at his own kitchen table. The shape never got a proper name in the valley. People simply called it the Merrill roof, and eventually, when new families arrived and asked why half the homesteads along that stretch of road had roofs shaped like turned-over boats, the answer they were given always started the same way. There was a blacksmith who lost his railroad and kept one piece of it anyway. It had never been about the iron holding heat. Iron does not create warmth on its own. What it did was hold a shape that refused to fight the snow directly, letting the weight slide past rather than settle in, while everything packed around it did the quieter work of keeping the cold outside where it belonged. The valley remembered the storm that took the Hargrove barn, but they remembered the roof that did not fall a little longer. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.